The ice cracked beneath her feet like a gunshot echoing across the frozen wasteland. And Xavier Dalton heard the woman's scream cut through the bitter Wyoming wind before he saw her dark figure plunge into the Sweetwater River. He had been riding back to his camp after checking his trap lines, his breath forming clouds in the January cold of 1877, when the sound reached his ears and sent his heart racing. Without thinking, he spurred his mare forward, the horse's hooves pounding against the snow-covered bank as he raced toward the place where the woman had disappeared beneath the surface. The water would kill her in minutes, maybe less in this kind of cold, and Xavier knew he had only seconds to act. He threw himself from his horse before she had fully stopped, his boots sliding on the icy riverbank as he grabbed the rope from his saddle. The woman had surfaced, gasping and thrashing, her heavy winter clothes dragging her down as the current tried to pull her under the ice shelf. Xavier could see the panic in her eyes even from 20 feet away, could see her strength already failing as the freezing water stole the warmth from her body. He tied the rope around his waist with practiced hands, secured the other end to his saddle horn, and waded into the shallows before diving toward her. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his muscles seize. He had been in cold water before, had crossed rivers in winter and knew what to expect, but nothing could truly prepare a person for the shock of it. He kept his eyes on the woman, kicking hard against the current, fighting his way to her as she struggled to keep her head above water. Her lips were already blue, her movements becoming sluggish as hypothermia began to take hold. Xavier reached her just as she started to go under again, his hand closing around her arm and pulling her against his chest. "I have got you," he said through chattering teeth, wrapping one arm around her waist as he signaled his horse with a sharp whistle. The mare backed up slowly, the rope growing taut and pulling them both toward shore. Xavier kicked to help their progress, holding the woman's head above water as the current fought to keep them. The woman had stopped struggling, her body going limp in his arms, and Xavier felt a spike of fear that he might be too late. They reached the shallows and he found his footing, lifting her in his arms and carrying her up onto the bank. He laid her down on the snow and pressed his ear to her chest, relief flooding through him when he heard her heartbeat, weak but steady. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, and she tried to speak, but only a weak sound came out. Xavier knew they were both in danger now. Wet clothes in this temperature were a death sentence, and his camp was still 2 miles away through the snow. He looked around frantically, spotting a cluster of large boulders about 100 yards from the river, and made a decision. "Stay with me," he said to the woman, though he was not sure she could hear him. He scooped her up again and carried her toward the rocks, his muscles screaming in protest, his own body starting to shake violently from the cold. His horse followed, well-trained and loyal, her reins dragging in the snow. Xavier found what he was looking for between the boulders, a small sheltered space protected from the wind, and he laid the woman down as gently as he could before turning to his horse. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely untie the leather straps that held his bedroll and supplies, but he forced himself to work through it. He pulled out his oilskin tarp, his blankets, his flint and steel, everything he would need to keep them alive. There was enough dry brush and small branches caught between the rocks to build a fire, and he gathered them with numb fingers, his teeth chattering so hard he thought they might break. The woman was unconscious now, her breathing shallow, and Xavier knew he had minutes at best to get her warm. The fire took on the third try, a tiny flame that he nurtured with shaking hands until it grew strong enough to catch the larger pieces of wood. Heat bloomed in the small space, reflecting off the rocks and the tarp he had strung up as a windbreak. Xavier turned to the woman and began removing her wet clothes, his movements mechanical and focused only on survival. Her dress was heavy with ice water, her petticoats and undergarments soaked through. He stripped her down to her chemise and wrapped her in his dry blankets, then removed his own wet clothes and added them to the pile. He had one more blanket, slightly damp but better than nothing, and he wrapped it around himself before adding more wood to the fire. The woman was still shaking, her body's attempt to generate warmth, which was a good sign. Xavier pulled her close to the fire and began rubbing her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, talking to her even though she could not hear him. He told her she was going to be fine, that she was safe now, that she just needed to hold on a little longer. He did not know if he was trying to convince her or himself. As the fire grew stronger and warmth began to fill their small shelter, Xavier finally allowed himself to take stock of the woman he had pulled from the river. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair that hung in wet tangles around her pale face. Even half frozen and unconscious, she was beautiful, with high cheekbones and full lips that were slowly regaining their color. Her hands were soft, not the work-worn hands of a farm wife or a washerwoman, and her ruined dress had been fine quality before the river destroyed it. Xavier wondered what a woman like this had been doing out on the ice alone. It took nearly an hour before her shaking began to subside, and her breathing evened out into something resembling normal sleep. Xavier kept the fire burning hot, kept rubbing warmth back into her extremities, and gradually felt his own body begin to thaw. The sun was setting now, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, and he knew they would have to spend the night here. His camp was too far to risk moving her, and the temperature would drop to deadly levels once darkness fell. He checked his supplies, taking inventory of what he had. There was some dried beef, hardtack, and coffee in his saddlebags, enough for a couple of days if they were careful. His horse had found shelter between two of the larger boulders and seemed content to wait out the cold. Xavier added more wood to the fire and settled back against the rock, pulling the woman closer so they could share body heat. It was not proper, holding a strange woman while they were both in various states of undress, but propriety did not matter much when survival was at stake. The woman stirred in his arms as full darkness fell, a soft sound escaping her lips. Xavier looked down and found her eyes open, staring up at him with confusion and fear. She tried to pull away to sit up, and he held her gently but firmly in place. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "You are safe. You fell through the ice and I pulled you out. We are about 2 miles south of the river, sheltering until morning." She blinked at him, processing his words, and then memory seemed to flood back. Her eyes went wide and she gasped, her hand going to her throat. "The ice," she whispered. "I remember the crack and then the water, so cold. I thought I was going to die." "You almost did," Xavier said honestly. "Another minute or two and you would have been too far gone. What were you doing out there alone?" She closed her eyes, tears leaking from the corners. "Running," she said simply. "I was running and I did not see how thin the ice was until it was too late." She opened her eyes again and looked at him, really looked at him, taking in his face and the blanket wrapped around his shoulders and the intimacy of their position. "You jumped in after me. You saved me." Xavier felt something shift in his chest at the gratitude and wonder in her voice. "Could not just let you drown," he said gruffly. She reached up with one trembling hand and touched his face, her fingers cold against his warming skin. "You could have died too. The cold, the current. You risked your life for a stranger." "What is your name?" Xavier asked, trying to change the subject because the way she was looking at him made his heart do strange things. "Julia," she said softly. Julia Grayson, and you are Xavier Dalton. I run a trap line through these parts. Been working out here most of the winter. Julia shivered and Xavier pulled the blanket tighter around them both, adding another piece of wood to the fire. She did not pull away from him, seeming to understand that they needed each other's warmth to survive the night. Outside their small shelter, the wind howled across the empty plains, and the temperature continued to drop. "Where were you running from?" Xavier asked after a long silence. Julia was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Salt Lake City. I was supposed to marry a man there, a businessman twice my age that my father arranged for me. I could not do it. I could not spend my life with a man I did not love, a man who saw me as property to be acquired. So I ran. In the middle of winter." Xavier could not keep the disbelief from his voice. "That is a death sentence, Miss Grayson. You would have frozen even without the river." "I know," she said, and there was such despair in those two words that Xavier felt his throat tighten. "I knew it was foolish, knew I probably would not survive, but I would rather die free than live as a prisoner in a gilded cage. At least that is what I thought before the water closed over my head, and I realized how very much I wanted to live." Xavier understood that kind of desperation, had felt it himself years ago when he left his father's ranch rather than live under the old man's iron fist. He had been 17 and angry, and convinced he could make his own way in the world. It had been hard, harder than he ever imagined, but he had never regretted his choice. Looking down at Julia's face in the firelight, he saw that same fierce independence that had driven him west, and something in his heart recognized a kindred spirit. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "I had heard there was a town called Lander further north, thought maybe I could find work there, make a new life. I did not have much of a plan beyond getting away." She laughed, a bitter sound. "Stupid, I know. A woman alone with no money and no prospects, thinking she could just start over." "Not stupid," Xavier said firmly. "Brave, foolish maybe, but brave." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "My winter camp is about 2 miles from here. I have got supplies, shelter enough to last until spring thaw. You can stay there at least until you figure out your next move. It would not be proper, you staying with me unchaperoned, but I figure we are past worrying about proper after this." Julia stared at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why would you do that? You do not know me. I could be lying about everything." "Could be," Xavier agreed. "But I do not think you are. And even if you were, I could not in good conscience send a woman out into this cold alone. My mama raised me better than that." Fresh tears spilled down Julia's cheeks, and she turned her face into his chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Xavier held her, one hand coming up to stroke her wet hair, making soft, soothing sounds until she cried herself out. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clearer, as if the tears had washed away some of the fear and desperation. "You saved me," she said, echoing her earlier words. "Not just from the river, but from giving up. When I was under that ice, I could feel myself letting go, could feel the cold taking me, and part of me wanted to just surrender. But then I felt your hand on my arm, felt you pulling me up, and I knew I had to fight. You gave me a reason to keep fighting." Xavier felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You saved me too," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them, but they were true, he realized. He had been alone in these mountains for 3 months, talking only to his horse, living like a hermit and telling himself he preferred it that way. But the truth was he had been lonely, so lonely it had become like a constant ache in his chest. Pulling Julia from that river, holding her warm body against his, watching life return to her face, it had reminded him what it felt like to connect with another human being. to matter to someone even if just for a moment. They sat together through the long night, feeding the fire and talking in quiet voices. Julia told him about her life in Salt Lake City, the daughter of a prosperous merchant who saw her only as a bargaining chip to increase his wealth and influence. She told him about the man she had been promised to, a cold businessman named Harold Winters, who had looked at her like he was appraising livestock. She told him about her mother, dead these past 5 years, and how much she missed having someone who loved her for herself rather than what she could provide. Xavier told her about his own past, about growing up on a cattle ranch in Colorado, about his father who ruled with an iron fist and expected absolute obedience. He told her about the day he turned 17, and his father told him he would marry the daughter of a neighboring rancher to unite their properties. He told her how he had left that very night with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back, and how he had been wandering ever since, working as a cowboy, a trapper, a hired hand, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. "So we are both running," Julia said softly as the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky. "We're running," Xavier corrected. "Maybe it is time we both stopped." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Julia looked at him with something like hope dawning in her eyes, and Xavier felt his heart skip a beat. He had known this woman for less than 12 hours, most of which she had spent unconscious, and yet he felt more connected to her than he had felt to anyone in years. It was crazy, impossible, the kind of thing that happened in dime novels, but not in real life. Yet here they were, two lost souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. As full morning light flooded their shelter, Xavier checked their clothes and found them mostly dry from hanging near the fire all night. He turned his back while Julia dressed, giving her what privacy he could in their cramped space, then pulled on his own stiff garments. The fire had burned low and he kicked snow over the remaining embers, packing up their camp with efficient movements born of long practice. "Can you ride?" he asked Julia, assessing her condition. She was pale but steady on her feet, her color much improved from the blue-lipped creature he had pulled from the river. "I can ride," she confirmed, though he noticed she swayed slightly when she stood. The ordeal had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. Xavier saddled his mare and swung up, then reached down to pull Julia up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed close, and he tried to ignore the way his body responded to her nearness. They had survived a life-threatening situation together. That was all. The connection he felt was just adrenaline and relief, nothing more. He almost believed it. The ride to his camp took over an hour through the deep snow, and Xavier felt Julia's grip loosen as exhaustion claimed her. She dozed against his back, trusting him to keep her safe, and that trust felt like a precious gift. His camp was situated in a small valley protected on 3 sides by rocky bluffs, with a lean-to shelter he had built against the largest rock face and a stone fire ring in front. It was not much, but it had kept him warm and dry through the worst of the winter storms. He dismounted carefully and caught Julia as she half fell from the saddle, her legs too weak to support her weight. Without a word, he carried her to the shelter and laid her on his bedroll, piling every blanket he owned over her shivering form. She was asleep before he had the fire going, her body finally able to rest now that safety had been reached. Xavier spent the rest of the day taking care of practical matters. He checked his traps and found 2 beavers, which would provide both meat and pelts to trade. He melted snow for water and made a thick stew with dried vegetables and some of the fresh meat, letting it simmer over the fire until the smell filled the small valley. He tended to his horse, making sure she had enough fodder and water, and organized his supplies to account for feeding 2 people instead of 1. As evening approached, Julia woke and emerged from the shelter, wrapped in one of his blankets. Her hair was a wild tangle around her face, and her dress was wrinkled and stained from the river, but to Xavier, she looked beautiful. She came to sit beside him at the fire, accepting the bowl of stew he offered with a grateful smile. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of a connection deeper than words. When their bowls were empty, Julia turned to him, her expression serious. "I need to be honest with you about something," she said. "My father will be looking for me. So will Harold Winters. They will have men searching, and if they find me here with you, there will be trouble. You could be accused of kidnapping, or worse. I do not want to bring that danger to your door." Xavier had already considered this possibility. How likely are they to search this far out? "You said you were headed to Lander. Would they not focus their search on the road north?" "Probably," Julia admitted. "But my father has resources and determination. He will not give up easily." "Then we will deal with it if they come," Xavier said simply. "But I am not going to turn you out into the cold because of something that might happen. You are safe here, Julia, for as long as you need to be." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm from the bowl she had been holding. "Why are you doing this? Really? You could have left me at the nearest town, washed your hands of the whole situation. Instead, you are offering to shelter me, protect me, risk trouble with my father and his men. Why?" Xavier looked down at their joined hands, trying to find words for feelings he barely understood himself. "I told you last night that you saved me too," he said finally. "I meant that. I have been living out here alone for months, convincing myself I did not need anyone, that I was better off by myself. But the truth is I was just hiding, running from the possibility of getting hurt again. Pulling you from that river, it reminded me what it feels like to care about someone, to have a purpose beyond just surviving day to day. You woke something up in me that I thought was dead, and I am not ready to let that go yet." Julia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I feel it too," she whispered. "This connection between us. I know it is crazy, we barely know each other, but when I look at you, I feel like I have finally found something I did not even know I was searching for." Xavier cupped her face in his free hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Maybe we are both just grateful to be alive. Maybe this will fade when the danger passes and real life sets back in." "Maybe," Julia agreed. "But maybe it will not. Maybe this is the universe giving us both a second chance at something real." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she met him halfway. Their lips touched softly at first, a gentle exploration, but then the kiss deepened and became something more urgent, more desperate. It tasted of hope and possibility, of 2 damaged souls finding solace in each other. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said, the single word holding more meaning than a dozen speeches. "Not just until spring, not just until you figure out your next move. Stay with me." "I do not even know where you are going," Julia said, but there was no real protest in her voice. "Neither do I," Xavier admitted with a laugh. "I have been drifting for 7 years, never staying anywhere long enough to build something lasting. But maybe it is time to stop drifting. Maybe it is time to find a place to call home." "What kind of place?" Julia asked, her eyes searching his face. "There is good ranching country further west in Montana Territory. Land is cheap there, and a man with some capital could start a small operation. I have saved most of my trapping money over the years, been too busy working to spend it. It would be enough for a start anyway." Julia pulled back slightly, her expression cautious. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" Xavier took a deep breath, knowing he was about to take the biggest risk of his life. I am saying I want you to stay with me, not as some woman I took in out of pity, but as my partner, my wife, if you will have me. I know it is fast. I know we barely know each other, but Julia, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. When I pulled you from that river, it felt like I was pulling us both back from the edge. We can build something together, something neither of us could build alone. For a long moment, Julia just stared at him, and Xavier felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He had laid himself completely bare, offered everything he had, and now all he could do was wait for her answer. Finally, she smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will stay with you. Yes, I will marry you. Yes to all of it." Xavier let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She clung to him just as fiercely, and they stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other while the fire crackled and the stars came out overhead. It was the beginning of something new, something neither of them had dared to hope for, and it felt like coming home. The next weeks passed in a strange but wonderful rhythm. Xavier continued working his trap line, but now he returned each evening to find Julia waiting for him, a fire burning and food prepared. She proved remarkably adaptable for a city-bred woman, learning to cook over an open fire and mend clothes and perform the dozens of small tasks that wilderness living required. She was not afraid of hard work, and she approached each new challenge with determination and good humor. They talked for hours each night, learning about each other in ways that went deeper than surface details. Julia told him about her love of reading, about the small library she had been forced to leave behind in Salt Lake City. Xavier promised her that their future home would have shelves full of books, and the joy on her face made his heart swell. He told her about his dreams of breeding horses, about combining the tough Mustangs of the West with quality breeding stock to create animals that were both hardy and refined. "We could do that together," Julia said excitedly. "I know about horses. My father had a stable in Salt Lake City, and I spent hours there growing up. It was the only place I felt truly free." They made plans, spinning dreams into something more concrete with each passing day. Xavier would finish out the trapping season, which would give them another month together in the camp, and allow him to build up his savings a bit more. Then they would head to South Pass City, a rough mining town about 40 miles west, where they could be married by the justice of the peace. From there, they would continue north and west into Montana territory, looking for the right piece of land to start their ranch. But even as they planned and dreamed, Xavier knew they were living on borrowed time. Spring was coming, the days growing noticeably longer, and with the thaw would come the ability for Julia's father and his men to search more extensively. Xavier tried not to let his worry show, but Julia sensed it anyway. "You are thinking about them," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. It was not a question. "I am," Xavier admitted. "Your father has had months to search now. Even if he focused on the northern routes at first, eventually he will expand the search area, and when he does, we will face it together," Julia said firmly. "I am not going back to him, Xavier. I am not going to marry Harold Winters or play the obedient daughter anymore. I would rather die than go back to that life." "It will not come to that," Xavier said fiercely. "I will not let them take you." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered how he could possibly stop them. Julia's father was a wealthy man with connections and resources. Xavier was just a trapper with a horse and some furs. If it came to a legal battle, he would lose. Unless they were already married when her father found them. The thought struck Xavier with the force of a revelation. If Julia was his wife, legally bound to him, her father would have no claim on her anymore. It would not stop him from trying, of course, but it would make things considerably more complicated. Xavier shared his thinking with Julia, and she nodded slowly. "You are right," she said. "Once we are married, my father's options become much more limited. But that means we need to get to South Pass City as soon as possible, before he expands his search this far south." Xavier considered the logistics. "We could leave in a week," he said. "That would give me time to finish processing the furs I already have and pack up the camp. It means leaving money on the table by not finishing out the season, but your safety is worth more than a few beaver pelts." "Our safety," Julia corrected. "Whatever trouble I have brought to your door, it is ours to face together now." The decision made, they spent the next week preparing for the journey. Xavier taught Julia how to shoot his rifle, insisting she needed to know how to protect herself if they were separated. She proved to be a good student, her hands steady and her eyes sharp. He also showed her basic wilderness survival skills: how to find water, how to build a fire without matches, how to read the land for signs of weather change or danger. In turn, Julia shared what she knew. She had a quick mind for numbers and helped Xavier tally up his furs and estimate what they would fetch at market. She also knew about herbs and their medicinal properties, knowledge passed down from her mother, and she showed Xavier which plants to look for and how to prepare them. They were building a partnership based on mutual respect and complementary skills, and Xavier found himself falling deeper in love with her each day. It was not just her intelligence or her adaptability that drew him, though he admired both. It was the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she sang softly to herself while working, the way she looked at him like he was the answer to a question she had been asking her whole life. It was the quiet moments in the evening when they sat together and did not need to fill the silence with words, and the way she reached for him in the night, seeking comfort and connection. They had maintained propriety, sleeping on opposite sides of the shelter with the fire between them, but as the week progressed, that distance became harder to maintain. They would wake tangled together, neither sure who had moved in the night. Their kisses grew longer, more heated, and Xavier found himself exercising every ounce of self-control he possessed. He wanted to do right by Julia, wanted to wait until they were properly married, but his desire for her was a constant fire in his blood. On their last night before departure, as they lay in their separate bedrolls listening to the wind howl outside, Julia spoke into the darkness. "Xavier, are you awake?" "I am," he confirmed, wondering at the tone of her voice. "Come here," she said softly. "Please, I need to feel you close." Xavier hesitated only a moment before moving around the fire to her side of the shelter. He slipped under her blankets, and she immediately curled into him, her head on his chest and her arm around his waist. They had held each other before, that first night when survival demanded it, but this was different. This was a choice, a declaration, and Xavier felt his heart racing. "I know we should wait," Julia whispered. "I know it would be proper to wait until after the wedding. But Xavier, we could die tomorrow. My father's men could find us, or we could get lost in a storm, or any one of 100 other things could happen. And if they did, I do not want to die having never truly been yours." Xavier felt his control wavering, desire warring with his sense of honor. "Julia, I do not want you to have regrets. I do not want you to think I took advantage." She pushed herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the firelight. "The only thing I would regret is letting fear and propriety steal this moment from us. I love you, Xavier Dalton. I loved you from the moment you pulled me from that frozen river. Marry me here now in this moment. Before God and the wilderness, let us pledge ourselves to each other." Xavier reached up and cupped her face, seeing the certainty and love in her eyes. "I love you too," he said, the words coming easily because they were so profoundly true. I love your strength and your courage. I love the way you look at the world with wonder even after everything you have been through. I love who I am when I am with you. Then marry me, Julia said again. We will make it legal in South Pass City, but let this be our real wedding, just us and our promises. Xavier nodded, his throat tight with emotion. They sat up together, facing each other in the flickering firelight, and joined hands. Xavier spoke first, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. I, Xavier Dalton, take you, Julia Grayson, to be my wife. I promise to love you and protect you, to stand by your side through whatever comes. I promise to build a life with you, a home with you, a future with you. From this moment until my last breath, I am yours. Julia's eyes shimmered with tears as she spoke her own vows. I, Julia Grayson, take you, Xavier Dalton, to be my husband. I promise to love you and honor you, to be your partner in all things. I promise to face whatever challenges come with courage, knowing I have you beside me. From this moment until my last breath, I am yours. They sealed their vows with a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a promise and a claiming. What followed was natural and beautiful, two souls joining in the most fundamental way, creating something sacred in that rough shelter in the wilderness. Afterwards, they lay entwined, both changed irrevocably by what they had shared. My wife, Xavier said softly, testing out the words. My husband, Julia responded, smiling against his chest. They slept wrapped around each other, warmer and more content than either had been in years. When morning came, they rose with purpose, completing their final preparations and loading Xavier's horse with their supplies. They would travel light and fast, reaching South Pass City in 3 days if the weather held and they pushed hard. The journey was demanding but uneventful for the first 2 days. They followed old game trails through the mountains, avoiding the main roads where they might be spotted. Julia proved to be a strong traveler, never complaining even when Xavier knew she must be exhausted and sore. They talked as they rode, continuing to learn about each other, and they made love each night under the stars, cementing their bond. On the 3rd day, as South Pass City came into view in the valley below, Xavier allowed himself to believe they might actually make it. They had seen no sign of pursuit, no indication that Julia's father had tracked them this far. Another few hours and they would be in town, making their marriage legal and official. From there, they could disappear into Montana territory, just 2 more pioneers looking to make a new start. They were less than a mile from town when Xavier heard the sound of hoofbeats behind them and felt his stomach drop. He turned in his saddle and saw 3 riders cresting the hill they had just descended, and even at this distance, he could see they were riding hard. Julia heard them too and looked back, her face going pale. It is them, she said, her voice tight with fear. The man in front is Lucas, my father's foreman. Xavier spurred his mare into a gallop, his mind racing. They could not outrun 3 fresh horses, not with 2 people on one mount, but they had to try. The town was so close, if they could just reach it, they would have witnesses, protection. His mare gave everything she had, her hooves pounding against the frozen ground, but Xavier could hear the other horses gaining. Stop! A man's voice bellowed from behind them. Stop in the name of Nathan Grayson. Xavier did not slow. They were only a 1/4 mile from the town now. He could see buildings and people moving between them. Just a little further. But then a gunshot cracked through the air and his mare stumbled, nearly going down. Xavier felt his heart sink as he realized they had shot his horse. She was still running, but he could feel her gait was wrong, could feel her strength failing. Xavier, let me go, Julia said urgently. Leave me and save yourself. They will not hurt me, I am Nathan's daughter. Absolutely not, Xavier growled, steering his struggling horse toward the town. We are in this together, remember. They made it to the edge of South Pass City before Xavier's mare finally gave out, her legs buckling beneath her. Xavier managed to get Julia clear before the horse went down, both of them rolling in the dirt of the main street. Xavier scrambled to his feet and pulled Julia behind him, facing the three riders who had now caught up to them. A crowd was gathering, curious townspeople drawn by the commotion. The lead rider, a hard-faced man in his 40s, dismounted with deliberate calm. "Julia Grayson," he said, his voice cold. "Your father has been very worried about you. He will be pleased to know you are alive." "I am not going back, Lucas," Julia said, stepping out from behind Xavier despite his attempt to keep her protected. "You can tell my father that I am alive and well, but I am not returning to Salt Lake City." Lucas's eyes flicked to Xavier, assessment and dismissal clear in his gaze. "This the man who took you? We figured someone must have helped you disappear so thoroughly." "No one took me," Julia said firmly. "I left of my own free will. Xavier saved my life after I fell through the ice. He has done nothing wrong." "That is for the law to decide," Lucas said. "Now, Miss Grayson, please come with us. Your father is prepared to overlook your little adventure if you return willingly. Make this difficult, and he will press charges against this man for kidnapping." Xavier felt fury rise in his chest. "She just told you she came with me willingly. You cannot charge a man with kidnapping when there was no crime." "Your word against mine," Lucas said with a cold smile. "And Nathan Grayson has a lot of friends in the territorial government. Who do you think they will believe?" Julia grabbed Xavier's arm, her grip tight. "He means it," she whispered. "My father will destroy you if I do not go back. He has the money and influence to do it." "I do not care," Xavier said loudly, addressing both Julia and the growing crowd. "This woman is not property to be collected. She has the right to choose her own path." "Not if she is under 21 and unmarried, she does not," Lucas countered. "By law, she is under her father's authority until she marries or reaches majority. And since she is only 20 years old, that means she comes with us." Xavier felt Julia's hand tighten on his arm, and suddenly he knew what he had to do. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Is there a preacher in this town, or a justice of the peace?" A tall man with a star on his vest pushed through the crowd. "I am Marshal Trent. I can perform marriages. What is this about?" "I want to marry this woman," Xavier said clearly. "Right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses. Julia Grayson, will you marry me?" Julia's face lit up with understanding and hope. "Yes," she said loudly. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Dalton." Lucas stepped forward, his hand going to his gun. "You are not doing this. Nathan Grayson will not allow it." The marshal moved between them, his own hand resting casually on his weapon. "Lucas, I know you ride for Nathan Grayson, but we are not in Utah territory anymore. This is Wyoming territory, and here we do things legal. If two adults want to get married, that is their right. You can tell Mr. Grayson that his daughter is a married woman and is no longer under his authority." Lucas looked like he wanted to argue, but the crowd was clearly on Julia and Xavier's side. After a tense moment, he stepped back, his face twisted with anger. "Fine. But Nathan will hear about this. He will not let this stand." "He can try to fight it in court if he wants," the marshal said calmly. "But I suspect he will find that is a losing battle. Now, you folks want to get married or not. I have got other things to do today." Xavier took Julia's hands, hardly able to believe this was actually happening. The marshal produced a small book and began reading the legal language of the marriage ceremony. Xavier barely heard the words, too focused on Julia's face, on the love and relief he saw there. When the marshal asked for rings, an older woman in the crowd removed a simple gold band from her own finger and offered it with a gentle smile. "For luck," she said. "My husband gave it to me 50 years ago. I would like to see it go to a couple who loves each other the way you two clearly do." Xavier slipped the ring onto Julia's finger, his own hands shaking. When the marshal pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier pulled Julia into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that half the town was watching. The crowd cheered and someone started playing a fiddle, turning the tense confrontation into an impromptu celebration. Lucas and his men left without another word, riding hard back toward Salt Lake City to report to their employer. Xavier watched them go with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had won this battle, but Nathan Grayson did not sound like the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. Still, for now, Julia was safe and she was his, legally and completely. The people of South Pass City took the newlyweds under their collective wing, offering them supper at the boarding house and a room for the night, free of charge. Xavier's mare had been shot in the shoulder, a painful but ultimately non-fatal wound, and the town's veterinarian agreed to treat her in exchange for one of Xavier's beaver pelts. It was not how Xavier had imagined his wedding day, but as he and Julia lay together that night in an actual bed with clean sheets, he could not imagine it being more perfect. "We did it," Julia said, her head on his chest. "We are really married." "We are," Xavier confirmed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "How do you feel?" "Free," Julia said simply. "For the first time in my life I feel completely free. My father cannot touch me now, cannot force me into a marriage or back under his control. I belong to myself and to you." "To each other," Xavier corrected gently. "Marriage is not about ownership, Julia. It is about partnership." She lifted her head to look at him, her eyes soft with love. "I know, and I cannot wait to see what we build together." They spent 2 more days in South Pass City, making sure Xavier's horse was healing properly and purchasing supplies for the journey north. Word of their dramatic marriage had spread through the town, and they were treated like local celebrities, everyone wanting to hear their story. Xavier tried to downplay the romance of it, embarrassed by the attention, but Julia seemed to glow under the townspeople's well wishes. On their last morning in town, the marshal approached them as they were loading their newly purchased pack mule. "Got word this morning that 3 riders matching the description of Grayson's men were seen heading back toward Salt Lake City," he said. "Thought you would want to know they are not hanging around waiting to cause trouble." "Thank you, Marshal," Xavier said, shaking the man's hand. "For everything. You saved our lives the other day." "Just did my job," the marshal said gruffly. "But I hope you too will stay careful. Men like Nathan Grayson do not forget easy and they do not like being defied. Keep your eyes open and watch your backs." Xavier promised they would, and a few hours later they rode out of South Pass City heading northwest. The land here was harsh but beautiful, all soaring mountains and endless sky. As they traveled, Xavier told Julia about the reports he had heard from other trappers, about the rich valleys of Montana Territory where the grass grew high and cattle could graze year-round. She listened with excitement, adding her own ideas about what their ranch could be. "We should focus on horses," she said enthusiastically. "Cattle are fine, but good horses will always command a premium price. We could breed working stock for ranchers and cavalry mounts for the army, but also riding horses for wealthy buyers who want quality and beauty." Xavier loved listening to her talk, loved the way her mind worked, always thinking 3 steps ahead. They discussed bloodlines and training methods, pasture management and building design, spinning their dreams into increasingly detailed plans. The journey north took 3 weeks, slowed by spring mud and a late-season storm, but they did not mind the delays. Every day was a new adventure, every night a chance to grow closer. They passed through the territorial capital of Cheyenne, a bustling city compared to the small towns they had been frequenting, and spent a few days there registering their marriage officially and filing a claim for homestead land in Montana. The land office clerk was helpful, showing them maps of the territory and explaining the various requirements for proving up a claim. They would need to build a dwelling, fence the land, and maintain continuous residence for 5 years. It was a significant commitment, but both Xavier and Julia were ready for it. As they continued north, the land gradually changed. The barren plains gave way to rolling hills covered in new spring grass, and then to the first signs of the thick forests that covered much of Montana territory. They passed through the small settlement of Virginia City, a gold rush town that had seen better days but still had a rough vitality to it. Xavier considered stopping there, but something told him to keep going. They found their land almost by accident, stumbling across a beautiful valley tucked between 2 mountain ridges about 30 miles northwest of Virginia City. A clear stream ran through the center of the valley, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, and the grass was already knee-high despite it being only early May. There was a natural meadow of about 100 acres, with another few hundred acres of forested land climbing the ridges on either side. "This is it," Julia said, her voice filled with wonder as they sat on their horses looking down at the valley. "This is our home." Xavier felt the rightness of it in his bones. The valley would provide everything they needed: water, grazing, timber for building, shelter from the worst of the winter storms. It was remote enough to offer privacy but close enough to Virginia City to trade when necessary. It was perfect. They made camp that first night in the center of the meadow, and as they lay under the stars, they planned where everything would go. The house would be on a slight rise overlooking the stream, positioned to catch the morning sun. The barn and corrals would be built closer to the tree line where they would have access to the stream for the horses. They would start small, just a simple cabin and a lean-to for the animals, and expand as their herd and their family grew. The thought of children brought a flush to Julia's cheeks and a tightness to Xavier's chest. They had not discussed it explicitly, but the possibility hung between them, full of promise and hope. Xavier imagined teaching a son to ride, or a daughter with Julia's dark hair and fierce independence. The images filled him with a longing so intense it almost hurt. The next few months were the hardest work Xavier had ever done. He cut timber from the forest and dragged it down to the building site with the help of their 2 horses, working from dawn until dusk every day. Julia worked beside him, trimming branches and stripping bark, cooking meals over their campfire and tending to the animals. When the walls of the cabin started to go up, she helped him lift the heavy logs into place, her strength surprising him even though he should have known better by now. By the time summer arrived, they had a snug 1-room cabin with a stone fireplace, a packed earth floor and real glass windows that Xavier had purchased from the general store in Virginia City. It was not fancy, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and their own sweat. The lean-to was up too, providing shelter for their horses, and the small herd of 6 horses Xavier had purchased with the last of his trapping money. They were eating dinner in their new home, celebrating the completion of the cabin, when Julia set down her fork and looked at Xavier with an expression he could not quite read. "I have something to tell you," she said, and there was nervousness in her voice that made Xavier's heart skip. "What is it?" he asked, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I am with child," Julia said softly. "About 3 months along, I think. I did not want to say anything until I was sure, but I am sure now. We are going to have a baby." Joy exploded through Xavier's chest, so intense he could barely breathe. He came around the table and pulled Julia into his arms, holding her gently as if she might break. "A baby," he repeated, hardly able to believe it. "We are going to be parents." Julia laughed, the sound slightly watery as tears leaked from her eyes. "Are you happy? I know we have not talked about it much, and I know the timing is not ideal with everything we are still trying to build, but I am so happy, Xavier. I have always wanted children. Not ideal." Xavier pulled back to look at her in disbelief. "Julia, this is the best news you could possibly give me. Yes, things will be tight, and yes, we have a lot of work still to do, but we will figure it out together. We always do." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach, marveling at the life growing inside her. Their child, created from their love and their joining, a physical representation of the bond between them. It felt like a miracle, like the universe's way of blessing the life they were building. Julia placed her hand over his. "I think it happened that first night in your camp after we said our vows. It feels right somehow that our child would be conceived then, when we made our promises to each other." Xavier had to agree. That night had been sacred, a turning point for both of them, and it seemed fitting that new life would begin in that moment. He kissed Julia softly, then more deeply, and they made love right there in their new home, christening it properly with their passion and their joy. As summer progressed, they continued to work on the ranch, though Xavier insisted Julia take it easier now that she was pregnant. She argued, of course, not wanting to be treated like she was fragile, but she eventually agreed to avoid the heaviest work. Instead, she focused on the garden she had planted near the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil, and on training the younger horses to accept a saddle and bridle. Xavier built fences, cutting rails from the forest and digging post holes until his back ached and his hands were calloused and bleeding. But every foot of fence was progress, every completed section a small victory. By August, they had 20 acres fenced for pasture and were discussing what livestock to add next spring. Xavier wanted to buy a few good mares in foal, start building their breeding herd with quality bloodlines like Julia had suggested. In September, they made their first trip to Virginia City as a married couple who lived in the territory rather than just passing through. They needed supplies for the winter, and Xavier wanted to establish accounts with the merchants there. Word of their ranch had spread, and they were greeted warmly by the townspeople, many of whom were hungry for news from the outlying areas. At the general store, while Julia was selecting fabric to make baby clothes, the proprietor pulled Xavier aside with a serious expression. "Had a man through here a few weeks back, asking questions about a young woman matching your wife's description. Said her family was looking for her, worried she might have come to harm." Xavier felt ice slide through his veins. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," the proprietor said firmly. "Told him I had not seen anyone matching that description, but I thought you should know. The man had the look of money about him, and he was not asking idle questions. He was conducting a search." "Thank you for the warning," Xavier said quietly, "and for keeping our confidence." The proprietor nodded. "You and your wife are good people. I can see that. Whatever her family wants, it is your business, not mine. Just watch yourselves." Xavier did not tell Julia about the conversation until they were back home, not wanting to worry her while she was pregnant. But that evening, as they sat by their fire, he shared what the shopkeeper had said. Julia's face went pale but set with determination. "My father," she said flatly. "He will not stop. He cannot stand to lose, to be defied. I had hoped he would give up after we got married, accept that I had made my choice, but I was fooling myself." "What do you think he will do?" Xavier asked. Julia shook her head slowly. I do not know. Part of me thinks he might just show up here and try to convince me to come back with him. But another part worries he will try something more drastic. He could claim you kidnapped me, get the territorial authorities involved. He has friends in high places. We have witnesses to our marriage, Xavier pointed out. We have a legitimate claim on homestead land. We have built a life here. No court is going to side with him. You do not know my father, Julia said quietly. He does not work through the courts when he can avoid it. He finds other ways to get what he wants. Xavier pulled her close, feeling the small swell of her belly between them. Then we will be ready. We will keep our eyes open and our rifle loaded. And if he comes, we will face him together. But as autumn deepened and the first snows began to fall in the high country, there was no sign of Julia's father or his men. Xavier began to hope that maybe the shopkeeper had been mistaken, or that Nathan Grayson had finally accepted defeat. They spent the winter months in domestic contentment, Xavier working on indoor projects like building furniture and Julia sewing baby clothes, and reading aloud from the small collection of books they had managed to acquire. Julia's belly grew round and full, and Xavier marveled at the changes in her body, the way she seemed to glow with health and happiness. They talked about names, debating various options without settling on anything definite. Julia wanted something strong and classic if it was a boy, and something beautiful but not frivolous if it was a girl. Xavier just wanted the baby to be healthy, did not care much about the name as long as Julia was happy with it. In late February, during one of the brief thaws that gave false promise of spring, Julia woke Xavier in the middle of the night with her hand pressed against his shoulder. "It is time," she said, her voice tight with pain and anticipation. Xavier had been preparing for this moment for months, had made sure they had clean linens and hot water, and everything the midwife book they owned said they would need. But now that it was actually happening, he felt panic rising in his throat. They were 30 miles from the nearest town, alone in their cabin in the wilderness. If something went wrong, there would be no doctor, no help, no one but him to save Julia and their child. "You can do this," Julia said, reading the fear in his face. "We can do this together. It is going to be fine." And somehow, her confidence steadied him. He built up the fire and set water to boil, helped Julia into the loose nightgown they had prepared, and held her hand as the contractions came harder and faster. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day, Julia working with a strength and determination that left Xavier in awe. He supported her, encouraged her, wiped her face with cool cloths, and felt completely helpless in the face of what she was going through. When the baby finally came, sliding into Xavier's waiting hands as the sun set on the second day, he felt tears streaming down his face. It was a boy, small but perfect, with a shock of dark hair and Julia's delicate features. He let out a lusty cry that filled the cabin, announcing his arrival to the world, and Xavier had never heard a more beautiful sound. "A son," Julia breathed, exhausted but radiant as Xavier placed the baby in her arms. "We have a son." They named him Thomas, after Xavier's grandfather, a man he remembered as kind and fair in a family that valued neither quality. Thomas Xavier Dalton, born February 27, 1878, in a small cabin in Montana Territory. He was perfect and beautiful, and Xavier fell instantly, completely in love. The first months of fatherhood were exhausting and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Xavier learned to change diapers and heat bottles when Julia's milk was not enough, learned to function on 2 hours of sleep, and somehow still complete his daily chores. Julia recovered quickly from the birth, her strength returning as spring arrived and the world outside their cabin came back to life. They fell into a new rhythm, one that included late-night feedings and the constant demands of a growing baby. Thomas was a good child, quick to smile and slow to fuss, and he transformed their lives in ways Xavier could never have imagined. Every tiny milestone felt like a miracle. His first smile, the way his eyes tracked movement, the way his tiny hand gripped Xavier's finger with surprising strength. As Thomas approached 6 months old and summer settled over the valley, Xavier began to think they might actually be safe, that Julia's father had finally given up his pursuit. The ranch was thriving. Their small horse herd had grown to 15 with the addition of several foals, and they had managed to save a modest amount of money by selling horses to neighboring ranches and to the cavalry. Xavier was in the pasture working with a young mare when he saw the riders approaching. There were 5 of them, well-dressed and well-armed, and Xavier knew immediately who they were. He dropped the mare's lead rope and started running toward the cabin where Julia and Thomas were, his heart pounding with fear and fury. Julia must have seen the riders too, because she met him at the door with Thomas in her arms and fear in her eyes. "It is him," she said. "I recognize the horse." "My father is here." Xavier took Thomas from her and handed him to Julia. "Get inside and bar the door. Do not open it unless I tell you it is safe." "Xavier, no." Julia grabbed his arm. "He will hurt you. Let me talk to him. Let me try to reason with him." "There is no reasoning with a man who has been searching for you for over a year," Xavier said grimly. "Get inside, Julia, please. Let me handle this." Julia hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the cabin with their son. Xavier heard the bar drop into place and allowed himself a moment of relief before turning to face the approaching riders. They stopped about 20 feet from the cabin, and the man in the center dismounted with the confidence of someone who was used to getting his way. Nathan Grayson was in his 50s, tall and well-built, with iron-gray hair and cold eyes that assessed Xavier like he was appraising livestock. "You must be Xavier Dalton," he said, his voice cultured and controlled. "The man who stole my daughter." "I did not steal anyone," Xavier said evenly, very aware of the rifle leaning against the cabin wall just out of reach. "Your daughter came with me of her own free will. We are married legally and we have built a life here. She is not going back with you." Nathan's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "That is what I told Julia's intended, Harold Winters. He was quite upset to learn she had married some dirt-poor trapper instead of honoring her father's arrangement. Cost me considerably to smooth things over with him." "That is not my problem," Xavier said. "Julia did not want to marry him. She wanted to make her own choice." "Julia is a child who does not know what she wants," Nathan said dismissively. "Always has been stubborn and willful, traits she got from her mother. But she is my daughter, my responsibility, and I will not have her throwing her life away on some wilderness fantasy." "She is 21 now," Xavier pointed out, "an adult by any measure, and she is my wife and the mother of my child. You have no legal claim on her anymore." Nathan's expression shifted, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "A child. She has had a child." Xavier cursed himself for revealing that information, but it was too late now. "A son. 6 months old and healthy. Another reason Julia will not be going anywhere with you." For a long moment, Nathan just stared at the cabin, his jaw tight with anger. Then he turned back to Xavier, his voice dropping to something quiet and deadly. "I could have you arrested for kidnapping. I have witnesses who will testify you took Julia against her will." "Bought witnesses, you mean," Xavier said. "There are plenty of real witnesses who saw us get married in South Pass City, who know Julia chose to come with me. Your lies will not hold up." "You underestimate my reach," Nathan said coldly. "I have friends in the territorial government, judges who owe me favors. I can make your life very difficult, Mr. Dalton. I can tie you up in court for years, cost you everything you have built here. Or you could save us both a lot of trouble and let me speak to my daughter." Xavier shook his head firmly. "Not until I know what your intentions are. I will not let you bully her or manipulate her." "She is my daughter." Nathan's control finally cracked, his voice rising. "I have every right to speak to her." The cabin door opened and Julia emerged, her chin raised defiantly despite the fear Xavier could see in her eyes. "Hello, Father," she said quietly. Nathan's expression softened slightly at the sight of her. "Julia, you look well." "I am well," Julia confirmed, moving to stand beside Xavier. "Better than I have ever been, actually. Xavier has been good to me, has given me a life I chose rather than one that was forced on me." "Look around you, Julia." Nathan gestured at the rough cabin and surrounding wilderness. "This is not a life. This is barely survival. You were raised for better things than being a rancher's wife in the middle of nowhere." "Better things?" Julia's voice shook with anger. "You mean being Harold Winters's property? Spending my life hosting dinner parties and pretending to be happy while slowly dying inside? No thank you, Father. I would rather have this cabin and this wilderness and a man who actually loves me than all the comfort and respectability you were trying to sell me into." Nathan flinched at her words. "I was trying to secure your future. Harold Winters would have provided for you, given you a life of ease." "He would have given me a prison," Julia corrected. "But I am not here to argue with you about my choices, Father. I'm here to tell you that I am happy, that I have found where I belong, and that I want you to leave us alone. Stop the searches, stop the threats. Just accept that I am an adult who has made her own decision." "I cannot do that," Nathan said, and there was something like genuine pain in his voice. "You are my only child, Julia. When your mother died, you were all I had left. I know I have been hard on you. I know I have tried to control too much, but it came from a place of love. I wanted the best for you." "Then respect my choice," Julia said, her voice softening slightly. "If you truly love me, accept that this is what I want. Accept that Xavier and our son are my family now." Nathan was quiet for a long time, his eyes moving between Julia and Xavier and the cabin behind them. Finally, he sighed, a sound of defeat that aged him 10 years. "May I at least meet my grandson?" Julia looked at Xavier, silently asking his opinion. Xavier hesitated, weighing the risks, but finally nodded. If Nathan wanted to build some kind of relationship with his daughter and grandson, that might be the thing that finally put this conflict to rest. Julia disappeared back into the cabin and emerged a moment later with Thomas in her arms. Nathan approached slowly, his hard expression softening completely as he looked at the baby. "He has your mother's eyes," he said quietly. "She would have been so proud of you, Julia. So proud of the strong woman you have become." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "I miss her every day. She would have understood why I left, would have supported my choice." "I know," Nathan admitted. "She always said I was too controlling, that I needed to let you find your own path. I did not listen, and I almost lost you because of it." He looked at Xavier, really looked at him for the first time. "Are you good to her? Do you make her happy?" "I try to be, sir," Xavier said honestly. "I love your daughter more than anything in this world. I would die before I let anyone hurt her, including myself." Nathan nodded slowly, seeming to accept this. He reached out and gently touched Thomas's tiny hand, a ghost of a smile crossing his face when the baby gripped his finger. "What is his name?" "Thomas," Julia said. "Thomas Xavier Dalton." "A good name," Nathan said. He was quiet for another long moment, then stepped back and straightened his shoulders. "I will not bother you any more. You have my word. I do not understand your choice, Julia, but I can see that you are happy, that you have built something real here. I will tell Harold Winters the debt is settled and that you are permanently off the market, and I will stop the searches." Relief flooded through Xavier so powerfully it made him dizzy. Julia moved closer to her father, shifting Thomas so she could touch Nathan's arm. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more to me than you know." "Can I visit?" Nathan asked, and there was such naked hope in his voice that Xavier felt his remaining anger dissipate. "Not often. I know I am not welcome, but perhaps once or twice a year, just to see my grandson and know you are well." Julia looked at Xavier again, and he nodded. "You would be welcome," Julia said, "on the condition that you come as a guest and a grandfather, not as someone trying to change my mind or control my life." "Agreed," Nathan said immediately. He mounted his horse, his men following suit, but paused before riding away. "I am sorry, Julia, for everything. For not listening, for trying to force you into a life you did not want, for taking so long to understand. Your mother would have been disappointed in me." "She would have forgiven you," Julia said. "Just like I forgive you. We all make mistakes, Father. What matters is that we learn from them." Nathan nodded, his throat working with emotion, and then he turned his horse and rode away. Xavier watched until the riders disappeared from view, hardly able to believe it was really over. Julia sagged against him, Thomas still secure in her arms, and Xavier wrapped his arm around both of them. "Is it really over?" Julia whispered. "Can we finally stop looking over our shoulders?" "I think so," Xavier said. "Your father is not a man who gives his word lightly. If he said he would leave us alone, I believe him." Julia turned her face into Xavier's chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Xavier held her, understanding that she was releasing months of tension and fear, letting go of the anxiety that had shadowed their happiness. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear, her expression lighter than he had seen it in a long time. "We are really free," she said wonderingly. "We can just live our lives now, build our ranch, raise our son without constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop." "We can," Xavier agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "What do you want to do first?" Julia laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "I want to expand the house. Thomas is going to need his own room soon, and hopefully we will have more children. We need more space." Xavier grinned, already planning the addition in his mind. "More children, huh? You thinking about a timeline for that?" "Well," Julia said with a coy smile, "Thomas is 6 months old now. Maybe it is time to start trying for a brother or sister for him." Xavier felt heat flood through him at the suggestion. "I think that can be arranged," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that always made Julia's eyes darken with desire. That night, after Thomas was asleep in his cradle, they made love with an intensity born of relief and celebration and pure joy. They were finally, completely free to live the life they had been building together, and the future stretched out before them bright with possibility. The next few years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. Xavier expanded the house as promised, adding 2 bedrooms and a larger main room. Their horse herd grew to 30 head, gaining a reputation throughout the territory for quality and good temperament. They purchased a small herd of cattle to help diversify their income, and Julia proved to have a natural talent for managing the ranch's finances. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic toddler who loved horses as much as his parents did. By the time he was 3, he was begging to ride every day, fearless in a way that terrified and delighted Xavier in equal measure. They taught him young, both believing that children on a ranch needed to know how to handle themselves around animals. True to his word, Nathan Grayson visited twice a year, always bringing gifts for Thomas and carefully respecting the boundaries Julia had set. The relationship between father and daughter would never be easy or uncomplicated, but it was healing slowly, growing into something healthier than it had been. Xavier found himself actually liking his father-in-law on occasion, especially when Nathan was playing with Thomas, and his business mask slipped to reveal the lonely man underneath. Julia became pregnant again when Thomas was 4, and this time the pregnancy was easier, the birth quicker. Their daughter arrived on a warm June evening in 1882, coming into the world with a head of red gold hair that mystified them both until Julia remembered her grandmother had been a redhead. They named her Elizabeth after Julia's mother, and she was as different from Thomas as night from day. Where he was bold and reckless, she was cautious and thoughtful. Where he loved horses, she loved books and music. Xavier built Elizabeth a small bookshelf and filled it with every children's book he could find, reading to her every night until she learned to read herself. He bought a battered piano from a family moving east and paid to have it shipped to their ranch, and Julia taught Elizabeth to play. The sound of music filling their home made Xavier's heart swell with gratitude for the life they had built. 2 years later, another son joined their family. Samuel was the perfect blend of his siblings, brave but thoughtful, physical but intellectual. He became Thomas's shadow, following his older brother everywhere and trying to do everything Thomas did. Xavier watched his children grow and play together and felt blessed beyond measure. The ranch continued to prosper. By the late 1880s, they were one of the largest horse operations in Montana Territory, their breeding program producing animals that sold for premium prices. They had hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, young men from Virginia City who were grateful for steady employment and a fair boss. Xavier treated them well, remembering his own days as a hired hand, and they proved to be loyal and hardworking. Life was not without its challenges. There were harsh winters that killed livestock, dry summers that stressed the grasslands, injuries and illnesses that tested their resolve. But Xavier and Julia faced everything together, their partnership only growing stronger with each year that passed. They made decisions together, worked side by side, and supported each other through the hard times. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier gave Julia a proper ring, a delicate band with small diamonds that he had ordered from a jeweler in Helena. She cried when she saw it, remembering the borrowed ring that had started their marriage, and insisted on keeping both. The borrowed ring went on her right hand, a reminder of their beginning, while the new ring joined it on her left, a symbol of the life they had built. Julia gave Xavier a journal that night, leather-bound and filled with blank pages. "Write our story," she said. "Write it down so our children and grandchildren will know how we found each other, how we built this life. I want them to know that love is worth fighting for, worth risking everything for." So Xavier began to write, slowly filling the journal with their story. He wrote about pulling Julia from the frozen river, about the choice to risk his life for a stranger that changed everything. He wrote about their time in the winter camp, about the journey to South Pass City, about the dramatic marriage and the flight to Montana. He wrote about building the cabin and the ranch, about the births of their children, about ordinary days that were extraordinary because they were spent together. As he wrote, Xavier realized that their story was not just about 2 people falling in love. It was about choosing to be brave, about refusing to accept the limitations others tried to place on your life. It was about building something lasting in a world that often felt temporary and uncertain. It was about the power of partnership and the strength that comes from facing life together. Thomas was 12 when he first read the journal, sneaking into his father's office one afternoon when he thought no one was watching. Xavier found him there an hour later, tears streaming down his face, the journal clutched in his hands. "Is this all true?" Thomas asked, his voice awed. Did you really save Mother from the river? Did Grandfather really hunt you down?" "Every word," Xavier confirmed, settling into the chair beside his son. "Your mother was the bravest person I had ever met, jumping into that freezing water even though she knew she might not make it. She chose freedom over safety, and that choice changed both our lives." "And you dove in after her even though you could have died too," Thomas said. "Why? You did not even know her." Xavier thought about how to answer that. "I could not stand by and watch someone die when I might be able to help, and something in me recognized your mother, even in that first moment. I did not know it then, but she was the missing piece I had been looking for my whole life." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I want to find that someday, someone who makes me feel like that." "You will," Xavier said with certainty. "When you are ready, and when the right person comes along, you will know, just like I did." Years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. Elizabeth went off to boarding school in Helena when she turned 16, her brilliant mind needing more than the ranch and the small school in Virginia City could provide. It broke Julia's heart to let her go, but they both knew it was the right choice. Elizabeth wrote home every week, her letters full of her studies and her dreams of maybe becoming a teacher or even a doctor. Thomas took to ranching like he was born to it, working alongside Xavier and gradually taking over more of the daily operations. By the time he was 20, he was essentially running the horse breeding program, his eye for good bloodlines and his natural way with the animals making him invaluable. Samuel, meanwhile, showed an interest in the business side of things, learning bookkeeping from Julia and talking about maybe going to business school. Nathan Grayson died in the spring of 1891, passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 64. Julia traveled to Salt Lake City for the funeral, taking Thomas and Elizabeth with her. Xavier stayed home with Samuel to watch the ranch, but he felt the loss keenly. Nathan had become a friend over the years, a man who had learned from his mistakes and worked to be better. His will left everything to Julia, making her a wealthy woman in her own right, but she chose to invest most of the inheritance back into the ranch and use some to fund Elizabeth's education. Xavier turned 43 that year, Julia 41, and they celebrated their birthdays together as they always did, with a family dinner and time alone to remember where they had been and dream about where they were going. Their hair was streaked with gray now, their bodies marked by years of hard work, but Xavier still looked at Julia and felt his heart skip the way it had that first morning in the winter camp. "You ever regret it?" he asked her that night as they lay in bed, the house quiet around them. "The choice you made to run, everything you gave up." Julia turned to face him, her eyes soft in the moonlight streaming through their window. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Every hard day, every struggle, every moment of fear, it was all worth it to have this life with you. You saved me, Xavier, in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," Xavier said, repeating the words he had spoken that first night so many years ago. "I was just existing before you, just going through the motions. You gave me purpose and meaning and a reason to build something lasting." They made love slowly, tenderly, their bodies fitting together with the ease of long practice and deep intimacy. Afterwards, Julia fell asleep in his arms and Xavier lay awake listening to her breathe, feeling the weight of their children sleeping in nearby rooms, looking around at the home they had built together. It was everything he had never dared to dream of, and it was real. Thomas married at 24, bringing home a sweet-natured rancher's daughter named Margaret who fit into their family like she had always been there. They built a small house on the far end of the property, close enough to help with the ranch but far enough to have their own space. Their first child, a son they named Xavier after his grandfather, arrived the following year, and Xavier felt a pride so intense it brought tears to his eyes. Elizabeth came home at 21 with a teaching certificate and a fierce determination to start a school in Virginia City. She had a beau, a young doctor she had met in Helena, and they married in a simple ceremony at the ranch the following spring. Samuel went to business school in Denver and returned 2 years later full of ideas for expanding the ranch's reach and developing new markets. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Xavier and Julia gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, turning things over to their children while remaining available for advice and support. They spent more time together, just the two of them, riding the property they had built or sitting on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "We did it," Julia said one evening as they watched their grandchildren playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze. "We built something lasting." "We did," Xavier agreed, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "And it will outlast us. Our children will pass it on to their children, and the story of how it all began will be told for generations." Julia smiled, that same brilliant expression that had captured his heart 25 years ago. The cowboy who pulled a foolish woman from a frozen river. The brave woman who chose freedom even when it meant risking everything, Xavier corrected. "We saved each other," Julia said softly. "We did," Xavier agreed. "And we have been saving each other every day since." They sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, hearts beating in rhythm, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Behind them, the house they had built stood strong and solid, filled with the sounds of family and life. Around them, the ranch they had carved from the wilderness stretched across the valley, a living testament to what two people could accomplish when they refused to give up on each other or their dreams. The frozen river that had brought them together was hundreds of miles away, but Xavier thought about it often. He thought about the crack of ice, the terrified scream, the split-second decision to dive into water that could have killed him. He thought about pulling Julia's limp body to shore, about the desperate fight to keep them both alive through that long, cold night. He thought about how close they had both come to death, and how that brush with mortality had opened them both up to truly living. He thought about the courage it took for Julia to run from a life she did not want, and the courage it took for him to open his heart to another person after years of solitary wandering. He thought about all the small choices and coincidences that had led them to that specific place at that specific moment, and he felt the hand of fate in their story. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Xavier pulled Julia closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his. They were older now, their youth left somewhere in the years behind them, but the love between them burned as strong as ever. Stronger, perhaps, tempered by time and hardship and the million small acts of devotion that made up a shared life. "I love you," he said, the words as necessary as breathing after all these years. "I love you too," Julia responded, turning to kiss him softly. "Today, tomorrow, always." They sat together until the grandchildren were called inside for bed, until the last light faded from the sky and the stars blazed overhead in their thousands. Then they went inside to their own bed, to the home they had built, to the life they continued to create together every single day. And in the morning, they would wake up and do it all again, because that was what love was. Not the dramatic rescue or the passionate declaration, though those had their place, but the daily choice to stand together, to work together, to build together. The choice to save each other, over and over again, in all the small and large ways that mattered. Xavier and Julia Dalton lived long, full lives, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. They watched the century turn and the world change around them, but their ranch remained constant, a place of stability and love in an uncertain world. When Xavier finally passed at the age of 76, he died with Julia holding his hand, his last words a whispered, "You saved me." Julia followed him 6 months later, unable to bear life without her other half, her last breath an echo of his final words. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their valley, their headstones simple but elegant, bearing their names and the years of their lives. And carved beneath Julia's name, the words that had started it all. She said, "You saved me." He said, "You saved me too." Their children gathered for the funeral, and their children's children, spanning 4 generations of a family built on love and sacrifice and unwavering devotion. Thomas, now an old man himself, stood before his parents' graves and read from the journal his father had kept, the story of 2 lost souls who found each other and built an empire of the heart. As he read, his grandchildren listened with wide eyes, hearing for the first time the full story of how their family began. They heard about the frozen river and the winter camp, about the dramatic wedding in South Pass City and the flight to Montana. They heard about building the cabin and starting the ranch, about the struggles and triumphs that marked those early years. And they understood, perhaps for the first time, that the prosperity they enjoyed, the land they lived on, the legacy they had inherited, it had all started with one man's choice to dive into freezing water to save a stranger. That single act of courage and compassion had rippled forward through time, creating a family and a future that neither Xavier nor Julia could have imagined in that desperate moment. The ranch continued for generations after, passed down through the family, growing and changing but remaining true to the vision Xavier and Julia had first dreamed in that winter camp so long ago. The journal Xavier had written was preserved and cherished, read to each new generation so they would know where they came from and what their family stood for. And sometimes, on quiet winter evenings when the snow fell soft and thick, the descendants of Xavier and Julia Dalton would stand at the windows of the old house and look out at the peaceful valley, and they would think about the frozen river hundreds of miles away where it all began. They would think about courage and love, and the power of choosing to save someone, even when doing so put your own life at risk. They would think about the cowboy and the woman he pulled from the ice, and they would understand that some rescues go both ways, that sometimes saving someone else is really saving yourself. And they would be grateful, so deeply grateful, for the choices their ancestors made and the legacy of love they left behind.